Hello and welcome to Uncommon Law, my podcast about true stories from my life experience of over 50 years as a lawyer and trial judge. This is a look at the law from the inside out, stuff they don't teach in law school. This is Judge Rudy Greco, retired Justice of the New York State Supreme Court. Jimmy Napoli was a bookmaker. Well, calling Jimmy Napoli a bookmaker is like calling Tom Brady a quarterback. Jimmy was a bookmaker on steroids, as it were. He was reputed that he had 2,000 people in his employ, in his bookmaking operation and gambling operation. They did sports betting, numbers, card games, Las Vegas nights, any form of gambling crap games, anything that you can imagine. Jimmy ran, and he was like the chief executive officer of a big organization. I met him at a wedding where I sat with a friend of mine and my friend's father, and Jimmy was at our table. And Jimmy was introduced to me, and then the friend's father was one of two controllers in Jimmy's organization. The controllers were the chief financial officers who took care of kept track of all the money coming in and going out, as well as all the human resource problems if somebody died or somebody got sick or what have you. And I met Jimmy at that wedding, and we became friends, and he hired me as a lawyer later on when he needed a lawyer. He had a few lawyers for different purposes, but he was an impressive guy. When I met him, he was in his mid-60s, and Jimmy was about 5'11" or 6 foot tall. He weighed about 180, 185, and he was very trim and in good shape. He was right out of Central Casting. You know, he looked like he could have been a Godfather. He had silver hair that was always nicely trimmed. He wore beautiful suits, very conservative, dark blue or dark gray suits. Always had on a white shirt and a silk tie, and the silk tie was expensive but not gaudy. It was always conservative, and it always complemented the suit he was wearing. His shoes were always shined to perfection. Even his fingernails and his manicure, his nails were manicured. They were never polished or anything like that, but they were buffed, and he was always very clean. And he wore his one piece of jewelry was very impressive, quietly impressive. I thought it was silver, but it turned out it was a platinum setting and a very large, but not ostentatious or gaudy in any way, a very large blue sapphire. And it was a really good-looking ring. And Jimmy was in the habit, when we go to court, he would always turn the ring backwards on his hand so that it looked like a band, and the judge didn't see it was a big, expensive stone. But Jimmy was born and raised in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. His parents were from Naples, Italy. They were Italian immigrants. And Williamsburg, when Jimmy was born there back in the 20s, I imagine, was a community of working class people, most of them Italian and Jewish immigrants who had crossed the East River from the Lower East Side, where they first arrived in tenements, and came across to Brooklyn when Brooklyn was considered sort of a suburb of Manhattan. So they crossed the river and they settled in Williamsburg. And Jimmy was, the streets were hard-scrabble streets, but they were all working-class kids. And Jimmy had gone to school and quit, I believe, midway through high school, wanted to make money. And he was an amateur boxer. Then he turned professional for a couple of fights. He had a few fights. And he was working in construction and doing, physical labor and heavy work. And he wasn't a well-educated guy, but he was a very intelligent guy and very perceptive. And he soon saw that the neighborhood bookmakers and gamblers were living a much easier life without heavy lifting, and they could make good money. And so he was attracted, and he became his own bookmaker. And he rose to the point where he had a gambling empire. And the gambling empire was reputedly, he was part owner he had two Jewish brothers childhood friends he grew up with, and they were his business partners. And supposedly they together owned pieces of casinos, 3 or 4 of them in the Caribbean, a couple in Asia, and 1 or 2 in Europe as well. And those guys, the Jewish brothers, were interesting guys in their own right. They were the owners of a national retail chain, and they backed some Broadway shows, and they had a very, very nice, fancy restaurant on the Upper East Side of Manhattan themselves. And Jimmy told me about them that He said these two guys were capable of losing $300,000 or $400,000 at a crap table in one night, and then laughing it off and taking everybody out for dinner with a big smile on their faces. He said they were quite the characters themselves. It was rumored also, and Jimmy never told me, that Jimmy was in charge of the skim in Las Vegas. In American criminal folklore, the story goes around that there's a skim that goes on in Las Vegas, that organized crime from all across the country gets money off the top of the daily or nightly receipts from every casino before they declare them for taxes or anything else. And that they call skimming the money off the top. And the skim is then divided according to a pre-arranged idea among all the organized crime families across the country from coast to coast. And the story is, and I heard it more than once, I'm inclined to believe it, although Jimmy never said anything about it, never even mentioned it, that Jimmy was the guy who was in charge. And he was basically in charge because everybody perceived him as a straight shooter. And they trusted him and respected him to the extent that they thought they would get a so-called fair shake of the proceeds and the right count. And speaking of the fact that Jimmy was a straight shooter, there were a few bumps in the road along the way to the point where he had this gambling empire. And one of them, a story was related to me by a retired policeman, Victor Kaufman, who went on in his retirement to be a polygraph examiner. And I had come across Victor and hired him as a criminal lawyer a couple of times. He was a lovely guy. And he turns out he was familiar with Jimmy from Jimmy's boyhood. They were almost contemporaries in age. And Victor had been a detective in Brooklyn North. And Brooklyn North encompassed the neighborhoods of Williamsburg and Greenpoint, where Jimmy lived. And he told me a story, and he said that apparently in one of the social clubs where there used to be these ethnic social clubs where people would hang out and gamble and drink and what have you, there was a card game or some kind of gambling going on, and there were 5 people involved, and there was a dispute. And one guy walked away from the club, walked out of the club, and he was upset and came back about 10 minutes later. And the next thing anybody knew, 4 shots were fired. And that guy walked out of the club. And when the cops arrived, there were 4 corpses on the floor. And characteristically, nobody in Williamsburg knew what happened. Really, nobody even heard the shots, supposedly. What shots? And the cops were flummoxed because they had no proof. They had no witness, couldn't get a witness to any of this. And there they had 4 homicides on their hands and in the books. And Victor said, we always believed Jimmy was the guy that walked out and came back with the gun. And he said we could never really prove it. He said, but we had pretty good information, a pretty good idea that it was him. And he said, I know he's your friend. He said, but I want you to know, don't ever underestimate your friend. He said, he's capable of doing anything that he wants to do or anything that he has to do. He said, I wouldn't put anything past him. Well, I didn't know any about this and until I heard from Victor. And then this was 40 years later when I was in touch with Jimmy, and I didn't know anything about that particular incident, although I could see it could happen. Jimmy was a creature of habit. He grew up in Williamsburg, and he never really left Williamsburg unless he really had to. He always was a neighborhood guy, basically, in essence. All these international casinos and everything else notwithstanding. And he had 3 businesses. There were 3 places, bar and 2 restaurants, that were basically functioning as his headquarters. He would go from one to the other, depending on the time of day. And one of them was the Highway Lounge, which was near the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway on Metropolitan Avenue, right on the block where Jimmy grew up. He bought the building on the corner, rehabbed the whole building, and on the ground floor, he put in the Highway Lounge. And he would spend 2 or 3 hours a day there, taking care of business. People would come in, report this, that, and the other thing. And Jimmy would then leave, and he would have lunch and dinner in alternating circumstances at 2 local restaurants. One was Creashy's, nearby on Lorimer Street, and the other one was Bamonte's. And Creashy's was owned by Jimmy's boyhood friend, a guy named Simone Creashy. They used to call him Cy. Cy Creasy, and Bamonte's was owned by Anthony and Anita Bamonte, who got that from their father. It is an old Italian restaurant, and the only one that still survives there in Williamsburg is Bamonte's, and it's quite a place. It still does very well. It's not, it's Southern Italian comfort food, and it's a neighborhood institution, and even generation after generation, they have quite a busy clientele there. Well, Jimmy and I, over the years, had many lunches and dinners in Creashy's and Bamonte's, and very often having a meal with Jimmy was a learning experience. I remember a few pearls of wisdom that I got, and one compliment. The compliment was at some time we were in a conversation about Jimmy's three sons who were grown men, and Jimmy said, "You know, Rudy, I love my sons, and they're all good. They're all good guys." He said, "But they gave me these gray hairs, and his hair was entirely silver, by the way. I don't know how he kept it with those guys because they kept his activity sheet full, catching up with their shenanigans. But he said, and I love them very much, but I would give anything to have a son like you, a professional guy, a lawyer or a doctor or anything," he said. And I took that very, in a very complimentary fashion because Jimmy was very choosy about who he associated with, and he didn't share his feelings with a lot of people. So I took that as a real compliment when he said that. Another time, along a humorous note, he noticed that I had been gaining weight, which was true. And he said, "Look, I see you're putting on a little weight. You're getting a little wide around the middle there." He says, "Have you ever considered a diet?" I said, "Yeah, but I put it off, and I know I've gained some weight. I don't want to. I want to get rid of this stuff." He said, "Well, why don't you try the Jimmy Knapp diet?" I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah, it's my diet. I follow this diet all the time, and it works." And he says, "Very simple." I said, "Oh, how does it work?" He said, "Very simple. The Jimmy Knapp diet is this: if you want to lose weight, push away the plate." And we both had a laugh, but it works. And I followed that diet over the years from time to time when I could muster the willpower. At another conversation, there was, I think it was something in the newspapers about a drug dealer who had been killed, and it looked like an execution. And Jimmy made a comment about the whole thing. He said, I don't like drug dealers. He says, I'm no saint. I'm not a Boy Scout. He says, and I understand that. And he says, in my business, there's some pretty rough guys running around. He said, but there's a difference between people like me and drug dealers. He says, and you know what that difference is? Drug dealers will hurt people they don't know. They ruin lives and kill people they don't even know. It's random. He said, there's no rhyme or reason behind it other than they just want to make a lot of money. He said, and I can't rationalize that at all. I don't see how they can get to do that. He said, I have nothing to do with them, and I don't ever want anything to do with them. I don't like drug dealers. And one other observation, which was a real pearl of wisdom, I thought. We were talking, it was another news article or something. Maybe this was about public officials who took bribes and were corrupt, et cetera, et cetera. And Jimmy's observation was, it never surprised me that people took. He said the only surprise was how little they took. And that was something because I remember that rang a bell because I remember in time in years past, Spiro Agnew was the vice president of the United States, and he took $20,000 from somebody. He got bribed for $20,000. He sold out his oath and his vice presidency. And there were members of Congress who were cited for taking Rolex watches. At that time, they were worth about $5,000 from foreign governments, to sway their vote and everything else. And Jimmy was a very, very astute observer of people. And aside from those many lunches and dinners, we did have two dinners that were actually very outstanding in my memory. And in one instance, I was sitting with Jimmy. I'd gone to collect some money that he owed me for a fee. And he said, "What are you doing?" And it was late in the afternoon. It was about 4:30. He said, "If you stick around about an hour or so, I'm going to have some guests for dinner here." We were at Monty's sitting down. He said, "And I'd like you to join us." He said, "I think you'd enjoy it. It's going to be nice." And I was used to Jimmy being a low-key speaker, and he never overstated things. He always understated things on purpose. And if he was saying it was going to be nice, I'm sure it was going to be nice, and he was inviting me. So I called my wife and said, "Look, I'm not going to come home for dinner, but I'm going to have dinner with Jimmy, and I'm going to be back early in any event because it's an early dinner." And I sat down, and eventually there was six of us for dinner. It was Jimmy and myself, Anthony Bamonte, who owned the restaurant, a friend of Jimmy's who was the owner of the jewelry concession at a very, very famous Park Avenue hotel. And he brought along two additional guests. And one of them was a young fella who was in his mid-20s. His name was Bobby Marks, and he was a law student. He was going to law school in New York. And Bobby Marks, it turns out, was the son of Barbara Marks, who was Frank Sinatra's fourth wife. He was his wife at the time. And Frank Sinatra was therefore his stepfather. This was Bobby Marks' stepfather. And the other guy was the real surprise of the event was Tommy Lasorda, the manager of the LA Dodgers. So we all sat down and we had a really nice meal, a lot of goings on back and forth. And Bamonte's was a hotbed of Brooklyn Dodger fandom. And the bar, the big bar room in front of the establishment was covered with black and white photographs of the Dodgers from the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s. And so from time to time during the course of the meal, we were dining for probably an hour and a half, 2 hours, somebody from the bar would show up. One of the old timers would come with a picture that he dragged off the wall and presented it to Tommy and say they knew Tommy was there, of course. It was, no secret. And they would say, Tommy, who's this? And they'd show him a picture of some old Dodger with a baseball bat or a glove or in a group photo. And Tommy would identify or try to identify them. And now he didn't get them all right. And whenever he missed, they would give him the business. And one guy finally said to him when he missed on one, he said, Tommy, where do you come from? He said, Pennsylvania. Well, the old guy said, Tom, this ain't Pennsylvania. He says, this is Brooklyn. This ain't Los Angeles either. This is Brooklyn, and we know our Dodgers. And you come around here, you better know your Dodgers too. And of course, everybody laughed and had a good time. A lot of fun. And the meal was winding down. And Anthony Bamonte said, Tommy, he said, I need a favor if you can help me out. And Tommy said, sure, Anthony, anything for you. If I can do it, you got it. He said, what do you want? He says, well, my chefs are baseball crazy. The two of them, that kitchen, all during the season, there's nothing. They're listening to the radios on all day long and all night. And they're listening to the ball games. That's all they do. They're really crazy for baseball, and they know you're here, and they want to shake your hand, if that's okay. Tommy said, wait a minute. Are these the guys that cooked this meal I just had? He said, yeah. He said, well, I want to shake their hand. He says, that was fabulous. He says, I haven't had a good meal like that in years. He said, I'd be happy to shake their hand. Bring them out. So Anthony goes back to the kitchen, and the kitchen was behind the glass wall, so everybody in the restaurant, the dining area, could see. It was spotless. And out comes these two guys, and these are dark-skinned guys. And their dark skin was accentuated by the fact they're in pure white chef outfits. They had the jackets and the white pants and white real robes or aprons rather. And out they come, and Tommy looks at them and says, hey, wait a minute. Shakes their hand. He says, you guys, you're not Italian, are you? And they said, no. He said, well, where are you from? And they said, Dominican Republic. Both of them said at the same time. He said, Dominican Republic. And he launches into a whole Spanish tirade, this, that, and the other thing. And he's speaking to them. And after, a few sentences and it was all done, I said, Tommy, you speak Spanish? He said, Rudy, I speak Dominican dialect Spanish. I said, how's that? He says, well, I was the manager of the Dodgers farm team in the Dominican Republic for 5 years. He said, that place is a conveyor belt to the major leagues. He said, do you know how many ball players come out of that little Dominican Republic? He says, it's amazing. The Alou brothers, he says, I can go down and name 50 major league ball players that come from there, and every one of them is a great ball player. He says, as a matter of fact, a couple of years back, on opening day of Major League Baseball, 7 starting shortstops came from one little town, a one-horse town, San Pedro Margaritas. San Pedro Margaritas produced 7 starting shortstops on Major League Baseball's opening day. Can you imagine one little town doing that? He said, and these guys, at this point in time, the two chefs, were so puffed up with pride. I don't think their feet were on the ground. They were levitating. They were about one foot off the ground. And anyway, it was a big, happy situation, and it was kind of unforgettable. The other dinner that was memorable was also in Bamonte's, and it involved about 18 people as Jimmy's guests, including Anthony Bamonte and his friend Cy Creasy and another boyhood friend, an Irish guy, Bucky, who was a retired police captain. I think he was in the mounted police, and they all grew up together, and it was really charming to see these old guys, in their later years, still friends. from their boyhood. And Jimmy's sons, a couple of other lawyers, and a couple of business associates of his from the gambling business. And after dinner, we all piled into three big Lincoln limousines, and they drove us to Madison Square Garden to see Muhammad Ali in a heavyweight fight against Ernie Shavers. I don't know if he had the title at that particular time. I'm not so sure. But in any event, it was a big celebrity filled event. And I remember we sat in the second row, ringside, and I sat right next to Jimmy and on one side because we used to go to the fights together, he and I, because both of us having fought, we enjoyed going to boxing and just talking among ourselves and analyzing the fights and discussing all the details. And on the other side, his immediate right side, was Cy Creasy, who was also involved in boxing with Jimmy for years and years. And behind us, a couple of rows behind us, I remember there were tons of celebrities, and I do remember because I was a fan, and was Chris Christopherson. I think his then girlfriend was Rita Coolidge, and they sat a couple of rows right behind us, and right in front of us in the first row, if my recollection serves me well, was a guy named Neil Della Croce, Agnello Della Croce. And Neil Della Croce was reputedly the boss of a powerful Brooklyn mob family. And Jimmy bent forward because he was right in front of us and whispered to him in like a stage went, "How you doing? How's everything going?" Made a little conversation. "Gee, you look wonderful. Everything all right?" "Yeah, yeah. Well, enjoy the fight." And that was it. And then leaned back. 10 minutes later, when the crowd was making some noise watching a fight, and Jimmy leaned over to me and whispered, he said, "Gee, did you see Neil? He looks like a corpse. The guy looks like he's dying." I said, "Well, that's not what you told him." He says, "Well, what the hell am I going to tell him? I told him he looks good and make him feel better." He said, "But he looks like he's got, one foot in a casket and the other one in a banana peel." And we had a little bit of a laugh, and the fight went on. And the best part of the fight, Ali won the fight, and it was an exciting night, and it was very, very nice. But the best part came a couple of days later when a cousin of mine, my cousin Joe, who was a detective with the Manhattan DA's office in the organized crime squad. And he came by and he had a manila envelope and he opened it up and he gave it to me. And inside was a black and white 8x10 photo. It was a surveillance photo of Jimmy and Cy Creasy. It was taken from the opposite. I think my cousin took the photograph, if I remember correctly, with a telephoto lens from the opposite end of Madison Square Garden. And he took the picture of Jimmy and Cy. It was a candid photo, of course, and but it caught them at an exciting moment when something exciting was going on in the ring. And there's these two guys looking up at the ring, and with a very excited expression in their eyes and on their faces. And he said, "You can have it. You could give it away. Do whatever you want to do with it, but don't say where it came from." I said, "Okay, Joe, that's no problem. That's a deal." I took the photo, and a couple of days later, I brought it to Creasy's and met Jimmy. I said, "Look, I have a surprise for you." He opened the envelope, and his eyes lit up when he saw that photo, and he got excited. He doesn't get excited very often. He said, "Cy," and he called out to Cy, who was working the cash register, as he always did at Creasy's. He said, "Cy, come over here." He says, "Take a look at this." And Cy sat down. "What is it, Jimmy?" And he showed him. And he said, "Rudy brought this photo. Look at this." And Cy's eyes lit up. He was excited. And the photo was so well received by the both of them that it ended up in the place of honor right over the cash register in the center of the bar at Creasy's. Right in the middle, surrounded on one side by President Nixon and on the other side by Pope John, the Santa Claus Pope, the little happy fat Pope that everybody liked. And it was a place of honor, and it was there until Creasy's closed when Cy died years later. It was in the place of honor at Creasy's bar. Well, as I say, and as you're probably getting here, Jimmy was quite a character in his own right. And I remember representing him in Supreme Court, Kings County. He was there for some gambling charges. And uncharacteristically, he showed up that morning at 9 o'clock when the part opened, or 9:30. And he wasn't dressed in his usual banker type suit. He was dressed he looked like a golfer because he had on a tan pair of slacks, a nice pair of loafers, and pink, I believe, polo shirt and a maroon cardigan sweater. And he looked tired. And I said, "Jimmy, what's going on?" He said, "Oh, Rudy," he said, "you got to get me out of here, get a quick adjournment. I got to get home and get cleaned up." He says, "I've been out all night. And I didn't even go home. I had breakfast and I came right here." He says, "But I'm dying right now." He says, "I started out last night on Broadway at Wall Street and I went to see a friend of mine in a restaurant that he owns, and then I went up Broadway, and I kept making stops all along the way until I ended up finally in Harlem, way uptown. And I was dropping in on all these old friends of mine that I hadn't seen in years and years. He said, and I had a great time. He says, but you know what getting old is all about? I said, not really. I got a way to go yet. He said, well, let me tell you, you could still do what you did when you were young, but you pay the next day, and I'm paying now. Get me the heck out of here as fast as you can. I really appreciate it. And I said, sure. I said, the case is not ready. We'll get the case called and get it adjourned, which we did. And the judge was very good. And Jimmy, characteristically, as tired as he was, remembered to turn his ring around when we were standing in front of the judge. And I asked him for a favor because I was on my way there. I had another court appearance that day, and that was at the 100 Center Street, the criminal court building, which was alongside the Tombs, the city jail in Manhattan, also on Center Street. And I said, Jim, I know you're going over to Brooklyn Bridge because he lived in a townhouse on the Upper East Side. I said, and on his way home from downtown Brooklyn, he would be going over to Brooklyn Bridge and passing near the courthouse. I said, you think you could give me a ride over there and drop me off at Center Street? He says, sure, Rudy, no problem. And it was a nice warm day, a summer day. And Jimmy had a white Cadillac convertible, and he put the top down. And on the front seat of the caddy was that day's Daily News. And I knew what the headline was. There was a photograph there and everything else. And Jimmy had made the headlines that day. And I knew it because I had seen it on my way to work that morning anyway. And he said, look at that story. And the story apparently was supposedly a big scandal that was revealed, referring back 2 years earlier when Jimmy was serving a 30-day sentence in the Tombs, the city jail in Manhattan, right next to the criminal court building. In fact, they shared the same big building. They're like twin buildings, and they share the same edifice. And Jimmy said, the story, he said, look at this. He said, they're giving my friend a hard time. And what it was all about was supposedly while Jimmy was doing his 30-day sentence on weekends, the guards would take him into the courthouse from the jail, into the courthouse, and put him in one of the judge's chambers where he'd get on the phone and order in food from the best restaurants for the correction officers, for the police, for the court officers. And he had a visitor every weekend there, and that visitor was mentioned in the story was a city councilman who happened to be Father Louis Gigante, a priest who was the brother of the reputed head of the Genovese family, Vincent Gigante, otherwise known as the Chin. And Jimmy said, how do you like this? He says, they're giving this Father Gigante, they said, they're giving Lou Gigante such a hard time. He says, and he doesn't deserve it. He said, do you know that guy went up to the South Bronx and he started an organization, a community organization, and they bought all these burned out and abandoned apartment buildings and rehabbed them and filled them, dozens of them, with the local people, at very low rents. He says, the guy should go straight to heaven just for what he did there. And here they are maligning him because he came in to have lunch with me while I was in jail. He said, and you know what? He's my friend no matter what. He says, he's a great guy. He said, and as for me, he said, look at these guys. He said, you see that marble? He was pointing to the edifice because at this point we had arrived in front of the courthouse. And he said, see that marble? When I was here, he said, I was in charge of the gang that had to clean that marble. That was our work detail. And that marble sparkled. Look at it now. And then this is the gratitude. He gets the paper and waves it at me, and he's laughing, pointing to the paper. He says, and this is the gratitude I get for doing such a good job. And he was a good sport. And that's what I really liked about him was he was very self-aware, and he wasn't kidding himself. And he could laugh at himself, too. Well, soon thereafter, Jimmy was on trial in the federal court. I didn't represent him there. He was represented by a former U.S. attorney who was familiar with the federal court criminal procedure, and he was a good lawyer. And the trial lasted about 4 weeks. And at the end of it, it was before the chief judge there in the Eastern District in Brooklyn, Judge Jacob Mishler, Jack Mishler, who was a tough judge, a good guy, but a tough judge. And when the trial was over, Jack Mishler pronounced a sentence for Jimmy, 5 one-year sentences, misdemeanor sentences, to run consecutively. And that was pretty harsh because none of them were current. And they were small charges, but added up together, they were added up to 5 years in jail. And I told Jimmy, I said, Jimmy, I know this Judge Mishler. I've had an experience before with him. and he likes me. I went to his house on a Sunday to get him to sign. I knocked on his door out of the blue to sign an order to get my client out of jail, a Jewish guy, because his mother had died in California, and he had to go to the funeral. He was the only child. He was the only survivor. And he was annoyed, but he kind of respected me for the fact of knocking on his door. And he likes me. If I make a motion for resentencing to reconsider your sentence, he might, just because he likes me, throw me a bone and reduce his sentence slightly, or he may even feel on second thought that the sentence was a little harsh, and he should reduce it. And Jimmy said, "No, no, no." He said, "Rudy, listen to me. If you heard the evidence that they produced at that trial, they spent 4 years and $10 million investigating me, and if you heard the evidence," he said, "they had the highway lounge wired." He said, "and they had incriminating evidence all over the place." He said, "And if you heard it, you would give me 5 years, as we call it, 5 years, 5 bullets back to back in criminal parlance." He said, "That judge was his own man. The agents and the U.S. attorneys tried to bully him and influence him and push him to a conclusion, and he never accepted that. He judged the case on its own facts." He said, "However, he gave my son, Jimmy Jr., he got 3 years, and I thought he got that only because he was my son." I said, "Jimmy, he got that maybe because of your son. I doubt it. Because as you say, Judge Mishler was his own guy." And I said, "He got that because you know and I know that Jimmy was high up on the organizational chart. He wasn't just an ordinary worker. He was an executive in your organization, and that's why he got the charge." I said, "I don't think the judge is going to change anything." He said, "You know what? Forget about it. You're right." I said, "And your son had so many doors open to him because he was your son throughout his whole life, and now maybe this door, being your son, was a disadvantage. Possibly. I don't even know if it was." He said, "No, I think you're right." And he was very good about that. He went away for 5 years. He went to Danbury Federal Prison, and I would hear from him once or twice a year. He would call, and he would ask me if I needed anything. Here's a guy in jail, and he's asking me if I needed anything. And I used to worry about him. "How you doing?" He says, "No, I'm doing the time." He says, "I got a good routine. No problem. I'm working out. I'm in good shape. I'm eating 3 squares a day. No junk." He says, "I play cards, play a little handball, this, that, and the other thing." He says, "I'm doing fine. The time is going by, and then pretty soon I'll be getting out on good behavior anyway. Don't worry about me." He says, "You all right? You need anything?" I says, "No, thank you, Jim. I need nothing." He finished the sentence, got out of jail, and sometime later he showed up at my office alone on 34th Street, between 7th and 8th Avenue, alongside Penn Station. I said, "How are you, Jim? I haven't seen you in a while. What's going on?" He said, "Rudy, I need a favor." He said, "I want to get a divorce." I said, "You want to get a divorce?" "Yeah." He said, I want to divorce Jean." Now, I knew his wife, Jean. His first wife, Grace, who was the mother of his children, died, and Jimmy was a widow. And after some years after Grace's death, he married Jean. And Jean was very glamorous. She was young, probably decades younger than Jimmy. Very, very pretty, actually beautiful woman. And she was a singer. She sang in a duet at the Rainbow Lounge and in Las Vegas at some of the lounges and some of the shows. She was an opening act for some very famous people. And Jim fell in love with her and he married her. And they had 2 kids. And I had represented her years before. Maurice Najari was a special prosecutor, and he was running a grand jury investigation into corruption in the police and organized crime and politics, etc. It's a wide-ranging thing. And they subpoenaed Jean, and Jimmy asked me to represent her. And I said, "Is there going to be any problem?" He says, "No, she doesn't know anything. I wouldn't put her in a position where she knew anything, and she could be a danger to herself and a danger to me." He said, "I'm not worried about that." He said, "But I don't want them to abuse her, and I would like to avoid the publicity if you could. I don't want her to get that kind of publicity. We have the kids and everything else." I said, "Sure." And I represented her, and I got it through, and they didn't abuse her, and I didn't make them. I didn't let them. And also, we avoided publicity. Well, he said, "I want Jean to come and get the divorce. It's a matter of pride." He said, "I'm getting divorced, Rudy, because while I was in jail, she fell apart. She started hitting the bottle and started taking pills and drugs, and she really, really deteriorated," he said. "And really, I wasn't there to keep her on the straight and narrow, and she got way, way overboard. And she's a shambles these days." He said, "But I want her to have the pride of getting a divorce." I told her, and she said, "Oh, she would come to you because I recommended you, and she likes you from the prior years." And if you do that, he says, and it'll be pretty much pro forma because she's going to be well taken care of. She and the kids are going to be very totally provided for. I have no problem with any of that. You know, money's no object with that. And he said, I know you'll do it right. I said, okay. Well, a couple of weeks later, this woman shows up at my office, and I didn't recognize the woman. Woman looked like a bag lady who had spent maybe a month in Central Park sleeping on a park bench with a shopping cart full of her belongings alongside. And she said, Rudy, hi. And I looked and I didn't recognize her. She says, it's Jean. I said, oh, yeah. And I covered right away. And I said, oh, Jean, how are you? So good to see you. Gee, it's been a while. But I was totally shocked. I had never seen somebody make such a big drop in their physical appearance. I mean, outside of cancer patients who were deadly ill. She, as beautiful as she was, she looked like an old hag, and it was just terrible. It was pathetic. Anyway, we went through the motions and a nice conversation, a little reminiscing, and everything else. Got her to sign the papers, etc., and I got the divorce, and there's no problem. And probably a month or so after the divorce, Jimmy showed up at my office again. He wanted to pay me the fee for the divorce, and once again, he was alone. And we had the discussion and everything else, wound everything up. And he said, Rudy, you have your car? I said, no, Jim, I come here from Queens, right here to Penn Station. I says, it's much easier to take the train. It's 15, 20 minutes, and I don't have to worry about parking. And I go home the same way. I said, why? He said, well, I have to go back to Creashy's. I said, well, where's your driver? Because he usually showed up with a driver, you know, waiting outside for him in a car. He said, no, he says, I sent him on an errand. He's got to go upstate. He says, and actually go to Pennsylvania to bring something to the kids. And I got to go back to Creashy's. I said, well, and I thought maybe I could get a ride from you. I said, Jim, I'd love to give you a ride, but I can't. I said, but I tell you what, I have to go downtown. I'm going to Surrogate's Court downtown. I'm going to take the 7th Avenue downtown. Why don't you come with me? We'll get on the subway, and you get off at 14th Street, and you take the L train to Brooklyn and get off. It's just a couple of stops, and you get off at Lorimer Street, and you'll be, you know, on the same block or a block away from Creashy's. He said, no, I know where the stop is. He said, Rudy, okay. He was a little hesitant. He said, all right, I guess that's about all I can do. I said, yeah, come on, I'll get my briefcase. So both of us dressed up in suits, Jimmy looking sharp as ever. And here he was alongside me. The next thing you know, we go in the subway. I had a couple of tokens. I put them in there. And we're on the platform of the 7th Avenue downtown. And Jimmy is wide-eyed looking around like a tourist. He couldn't believe it. He says, wow. He says, this is really nice. He says, you know, you hear all these stories about the subway, but he says, this is not bad at all. It's quite good. And there was an old black guy that was standing there near us, an old black gentleman, and he was observing us. He was kind of out of earshot, but he could see Jimmy's expression, and I guess he figured Jimmy was a tourist or an out of town or something like that, or who knows what he thought. But he caught, you know, the whole idea that Jimmy hadn't been in the subway ever or for some time. And he kind of smiled and looked at me, and I acknowledged him with a wink, and he winked back. And Jimmy got on the train, and we were going downtown, and he said, you know, Rudy, I haven't been on a subway for 60 years since I was 18 years old. Now he was 78, obviously. He said, this is my first trip. He says, and when I get to Creashy's and I tell them I came from your office on the subway, nobody's going to believe me. They're just not going to believe me. I don't get it. He says, it's just not going to happen. I said, well, you know, you'll do your best. Well, Jimmy got there, got to Creashy's, and of course nobody believed him, but they took him at his word eventually. And he told me years before, he died soon after that, and he died in bed. He was in his 80s when he died, and he died peacefully in bed, and which was really good and rare for guys in that business. And it reminded me of when he told me that he had once, in a prior dinner, he told me, he said, you know, he was offered the job to be boss of a crime family and to be a godfather. And he turned them down, and they persisted, and they went after him and said, no, you got to take the job. Who's going to do it? You're responsible. You do it. You'll be good. And he said, I wouldn't do it. I turned down the job. I said, why did you do that, Jim? He says, Rudy, I'm a businessman. He says, I want to make money and go home. He said, I have no ambition to be a tough guy or anything else. He said, and if you're a godfather, He said, you might as well just get a target and hang it around your neck. He said, because everybody is after your job. They're jealous and they're ambitious or anything else. He said, and you got to get yourself in trouble and make enemies. He says, I don't want to do that. And I turned that thing down, and I never regretted turning it down. Well, the fact that he died in bed was a testament to his good judgment. And I have to say that a good part of wisdom is knowing when you're well off. And this wise guy, Jimmy Napoli, was also a wise man. He knew when he was well off. Thanks for listening. Come back next week for another episode of Uncommon Law, lessons they don't teach in law school. I'm Judge Rudy Greco. Court is adjourned.